Hello everyone, RJM3 here. Now, if you're a teenager or young adult living in the United States, which according to this channel's demographics, you probably are, your biggest concern in your day-to-day life is wealth disparity.
In recent decades, with control of the markets being consolidated in the hands of a few powerful corporations, said corporations have been able to run smaller companies out of business, coldly mistreat their own employees, and allow the richest 1% of people to control more than 50% of the wealth in the world. This system of economics is known as corporatocracy. I briefly mentioned it in the last video, but I didn't really elaborate on what it was, so I'll explain it here. While capitalism has all businesses competing with each other, sparking innovation that benefits society as a whole, corporatocracy has a handful of large businesses working together to take over the market and screw over the common man. Furthermore, while capitalism believes the state should not interfere with the market, and while leftists believe the state should control the market, corporatocracy effectively has the market controlling the state. Corporations essentially bribe judicial and political entities into favoring corporate interests, stunting the state's ability to carry out effective policy, again, screwing over the common man. Because of corporatocracy, it has become more and more difficult for our nation's youth to make a living, thus making leftist ideologies such as socialism and communism look more appealing to younger generations, despite all the human suffering leftist ideology has caused in the past. But what if I told you all of this had happened once before? Let's talk about the Gilded Age, an era in American history from the 1870s to the 1900s, which saw rapid industrialization and economic growth, as well as the rise of corporations, back then known as trusts, controlling many industries, such as oil, steel, sugar, and beef. Excessive control of the market by these trusts led to widespread poverty, terrible working conditions, and government corruption. And just like the present day, the resulting wealth disparity between classes led to a lot of socialist sympathy.
This, of course, brings us to a book I was forced to read earlier this year for a political science class as a college freshman. The Jungle, by Upton Sinclair.
Upton Sinclair was an American socialist and political activist when he wrote The Jungle in 1906. The novel itself is a political fictional story about a large Lithuanian migrant family arriving in Chicago and finding work in the meatpacking industry, hoping to achieve the American dream. At the start of the novel, the main protagonist, Jurgis Rudkis, believes simply through hard work he could easily provide for himself and his family. However, as the story progresses, the family are paid too little for their work, repeatedly screwed out of their savings, forced to work and live in dreadful conditions, and many family members get injured, go missing, and even die along the way. Following all the hardship his family had been forced into, Jurgis is introduced to socialism and proudly joins the Socialist Party. The novel ends with Jurgis attending a Socialist Party gathering as the Socialists make significant gains in state and local elections all across America. While writing The Jungle, Sinclair actually snuck into meatpacking facilities disguised as an employee to observe their horrid working conditions and inserted them into the novel. Sinclair was rightfully disgusted by the treatment of the working class, as any sensible individual would be, and he wanted a solution. And to Sinclair, that solution was socialism. Sinclair fully trusted in socialism and believed that his novel would inspire millions of Americans to become socialists and bring about a socialist utopia. But of course, that never happened. 5 years prior to The Jungle's publication, Theodore Roosevelt, the greatest Chad in American history, became president. Roosevelt was part of America's progressive movement, a movement which sought to fix many of the political and social ills plaguing American society. So while in office, Roosevelt began an aggressive campaign of trust busting, in which the federal government broke up the monopolies which dominated America's economy into many smaller businesses. Following the trust busting, the American standard of living greatly improved over the following 2 decades up until the Great Depression. The progressive movement and its trust busting essentially saved America from further economic and political strife. The breakup of corporate power renewed public confidence in the system, significantly decreasing the enthusiasm for more radical change, and in any chance socialism had to play a major role in early 20th century American politics.
Though, The Jungle did get me thinking. What if the ending of the novel had actually happened in real life? What if Theodore Roosevelt never became president, and the progressive movement as a whole failed to bring any reform against the trusts, resulting in support for socialism skyrocketing across America? What if the Gilded Age sparked a socialist revolution?
Our initial point of divergence is on September 6, 1901, with the assassination of U.S. President William McKinley at the hands of Polish-American anarchist Leon Czolgosz. In our timeline, following McKinley's death, Roosevelt, who was vice president at the time, took over the presidency, beginning his Square Deal program, which led to conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. In this new alternate timeline, McKinley survives the attempt on his life and serves out the rest of his second term. While this would keep Roosevelt out of office in the short term, it is not a permanent solution. Prior to McKinley's assassination in our timeline, Roosevelt believed that the vice presidency could be used as a means to help propel him to the presidency in 1904. So even if McKinley survived, there's a good chance Roosevelt still would have become president anyway. But don't worry, that's what secondary points of divergence are for. In our timeline, the 1904 Republican National Convention had two possible candidates for president: the incumbent Roosevelt and his anti-progressive, pro-business rival, Ohio Senator Mark Hanna. Unfortunately for Hanna, his presidential bid ended abruptly when he died of typhoid fever in February of that year, leaving Roosevelt as the presumptive nominee and eventually securing a second term. So in the alternate timeline, let's say Hanna never catches typhoid fever, but instead Roosevelt does, leaving Hanna as the presumptive nominee, defeating the Democrats in November and becoming the 25th President of the United States. Under the Hanna administration, the federal government begins favoring policies favorable to the trusts. Not only is no attempt made to break up the trusts, but pre-existing laws meant to limit the trusts, such as the 1887 Interstate Commerce Act and the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, are repealed. President Hanna even gets the national government to intervene in stopping any attempts at social reform on the state level, especially in states like New York. Workplace safety regulations, such as the ones that were made after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 of our timeline, are never passed, leading to more workplace tragedies. The Gilded Age survives into the 1910s, as trusts continue to grow more powerful, the government more corrupt, and the average American more impoverished. With the complete and utter failure by the progressive movement to make any meaningful social or political reform, a greater socialist movement begins to take shape. When Sinclair still publishes The Jungle in this alternate timeline, it becomes much more popular with the general public. After Hanna serves 2 terms in office, the 1912 election would be very different from the one we're familiar with. In our timeline, the election was between the Republican incumbent William Howard Taft, Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt running for his short-lived Progressive Party, and Eugene V. Debs running for the Socialist Party. Since Roosevelt would have already passed away in this alternate timeline, there would be no Progressive Party, and because Roosevelt was the reason Taft rose to prominence in the first place, he would have never been on the ballot, so the Republicans would have to nominate someone else, most likely Secretary of State Philander C. Knox, a compromise candidate between the progressive and conservative factions in the Republican Party. Without Roosevelt splitting the vote, the Republicans would have defeated the Democrats. With Knox in the White House for the next 4 years, he attempts to strike a balance between the progressive and pro-business agendas, but ultimately ends up doing more for the pro-business faction, as the trusts would have near total control over Congress by this point. In our timeline, the Socialists were unable to win any electoral college votes in 1912, but in this alternate timeline, the Socialist Party is actually able to rally enough support across the country to win a handful of states in the Industrial Belt and the West Coast, legitimizing their movement and beginning serious leftist opposition to the establishment. The Socialists would view both major parties as being the same, doing nothing to help the common man. The Socialists would also despise the progressive movement, viewing them as too weak and ineffective, believing only radical change could yield results. Protests and workers' strikes against the government and the trusts would break out across the country in the first few years following the election. 1914, and World War I breaks out in Europe. The American general public doesn't really care about the war and would prefer the United States stay out of the conflict and maybe try to focus on more domestic issues. The growing Socialist Party takes a firm stance against joining the war, attracting many Americans who want to respect George Washington's wishes in his farewell address to keep America out of European entanglements. When the 1916 election rolls around, American politics are a complete mess. The progressive movement is basically dead, the popularity of the Republican and Democratic parties is declining, labor strikes by the Socialists start to turn riotous, poverty and wealth disparity is at an all-time high, and the corporations practically run the country at this point. The situation is primed for the socialist revolution that Sinclair dreamt of. The question is, will this be a peaceful revolution achieved through democracy, or a violent revolution? achieved through civil war. While Sinclair would have preferred the former, the latter is quite frankly more realistic, because do any of you honestly believe an establishment dominated by corporate interests would just allow a socialist to become president? So I'm just going to cover both scenarios. In the timeline where the revolution is peaceful, the Socialist Party narrowly wins the majority of electoral college votes. Their candidate, who would likely be Debs again given the movement's greater popularity, is sworn in on March 4, 1917. Given the Socialist Party's anti-war stance, the German Empire has no reason to fear American entry into the Great War and never tries to send the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico, leaving America out of the conflict. Germany never squanders its remaining resources, manpower, and morale in the 1918 spring offensive in a desperate attempt to win the war before American troops can arrive in Europe. Instead, the Germans are given enough time to consolidate all the resources gained in the East and defeat the Entente in 1919. Back in America, almost immediately after Debs enters office, he goes on an aggressive campaign of implementing all the wacky policies of the Socialist Party platform. These policies include, but are not limited to, ending the Monroe Doctrine, independence for the Philippines, making declarations of war only possible through national referendum, the abolition of the Senate, the abolition of the Electoral College, collectivization of all means of transportation and communication, and the collectivization of land. Now, some of those policies may sound good and even tempting, so long as you don't realize that ended the Monroe Doctrine would just lead to other major powers to spread their influence into Latin America and weaken the United States' position on the world stage, that independence for the Philippines that early on would leave them vulnerable to the Empire of Japan, that declarations of war by direct democracy worked out terribly for ancient Athens, as the public can easily be manipulated and riled up into declaring a war that may not be so easy, that abolishing the Senate and the Electoral College would disenfranchise voters in smaller states, or that collectivization always inevitably leads to bureaucratic mismanagement, making everyone's lives miserable. While fairer labor laws are passed, overall, most socialist policies, if implemented, would quickly backfire. That's not even mentioning all the egregiously high taxes or that a state-managed economy doesn't spark much innovation, dragging American industry years behind the rest of the world. After years in charge and all their schemes backfiring, the Socialist Party might even get voted out of power in the following elections. But there also exists the possibility that the Socialists might not want to give up their power. If historical precedent is anything to go by, this is a legitimate possibility. Democratic socialism is an oxymoron. Socialism, by its very nature of having the state manhandle the economy, is inherently authoritarian, and the state controlling the economy is the government's gateway drug into controlling the masses. In the end, idealists like Debs and Sinclair might just get shoved aside by more opportunistic elements within the party. In the timeline where the revolution gets violent, no party is able to win a majority of electoral college votes in 1916. The presidential election goes to the House of Representatives, and Wilson, who would be running again on a progressive platform, gets the most electors. While it is true that Wilson was a terrible president and a terrible person in general, his one redeeming quality is that he expanded upon Roosevelt and Taft's earlier trust-busting. Prior to Wilson's inauguration, there is a glimmer of hope that the progressives can finally get their act together and save the country. But then, the Zimmermann telegram is discovered, turning Wilson's attention away from domestic issues and towards war. Wilson, having an overly idealistic worldview, believed it was America's God-given duty to get involved in foreign affairs to spread democratic ideals. The majority of Americans really wouldn't care about the Zimmermann telegram in this alternate timeline, and would rather just let the issue go due to more pressing issues at home. But despite all this, just a month after ascending to the presidency, Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war on Germany, entering the First World War. The public would be outraged. How could the government tell us we have to fight to promote democracy abroad when our democracy at home is failing? When most Americans can't even afford a decent standard to live in? What kind of sick joke is that? In late 1918, when the bodies of young American men are shipped back from Europe in caskets, class tensions that had been building up for years finally boil over. Protests turn into riots, riots turn into a general strike, and a general strike turns into insurrection. Inspired by the October Revolution in Russia the year prior, armed socialist militants stormed the White House and the Capitol building. President Wilson and much of Congress is taken prisoner. Wilson is shortly executed by the revolutionaries. Insurrection and secession spreads across the industrial belt and the West Coast as the Union of Socialist States of America is proclaimed. Whatever is left of the government and the military forms a provisional government still loyal to the USA and calls America's armed forces back from Europe to fight the Second American Civil War. While Europe's nightmare soon ends with an Entente victory, America's nightmare has only just begun. As the Loyalists and Socialists battle for control over the country, thousands of Americans, soldiers and civilians alike, are killed. The outcome of the conflict doesn't really matter. If the Socialists win, America is stuck with a leftist totalitarian state that imposes its control over the lives of everyday citizens. If the Loyalists win, America is stuck with a rightist military junta ruling over a country devastated by war, continuing to favor corporate interests, ignoring the plight of the average citizen. The conflict could perhaps have no winner and only end up fracturing America into several rump states. At the end of the day, regardless of whether or not the revolution was peaceful, regardless of which side wins the Civil War, if any, America would be doomed and unable to face the coming challenges of the 20th century. And if nothing is done about the corporatocracy now, in the present, of this timeline, America will be doomed and unable to face the coming challenges of the 21st century.
Unchallenged corporatocracy inevitably incites a volatile reaction by the far left. This is the path to civil war, a civil war which would kill millions of Americans, destroy our infrastructure, permanently balkanize this beautiful nation, and open up a power vacuum on the world stage which China, Russia, and Iran would only be more than happy to fill. But there's another way. What America needs is a new progressive movement. Not the kind of progressivism that obsesses over unimportant nonsense like white privilege or pronouns. I mean real progressivism, led by young, enlightened, good-natured individuals that seek to solve the actual problems Americans are facing. Not just the wealth disparity, but also big tech, big pharma, the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, the national debt, obesity, etc. A second progressive movement alone can make all the difference between a second American Civil War and a second American century. This has been RGM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.